In the fall of 1882, a man named Dale Fisher sat at a pine table in a 40-acre ranch in the Canyon Creek Valley of southern Colorado Territory and wrote a letter describing a life he did not have. He had done this 59 times before. He was 31 years old, and the letters had grown more elaborate with each draft, not because he was reckless with dishonesty, but because each reply he received from St. Louis asked another question he felt compelled to answer grandly. 300 head of cattle, he had written. A finished house with a proper wood floor. A prosperous operation in a country that rewarded hard work and good sense. He signed each letter with the same careful hand and folded it into thirds and walked it to the Canyon Creek post office on Tuesdays, and the woman who sorted the mail never asked him a thing, which was either mercy or incuriosity, and he was grateful for both. The truth of the matter was 31 cattle, a feed debt of $240 owed to a supplier in Pueblo, a house with a dirt floor, and a single room that smelled of pine pitch and cow, and 40 acres that had not yet decided whether they were going to be useful. Dale was not a dishonest man by nature. He had never cheated a neighbor on a fence line or shorted a hand his wages. The letters were a separate problem, a thing he had started in a moment of private ambition and could not now undo without losing the correspondence entirely, and the correspondence had become, by summer of 1882, the best part of his weeks. Her name was Vera Collier. She was 28, recently widowed from a first marriage in Sangamon County, Illinois, a marriage she described to Dale only as one that had not suited either party, which was the politest arrangement of words she could find for what had in fact been 2 years of grinding diminishment, followed by a fever that took her husband in January and left her with a clear debt and an unclear future. She had found the matrimonial agency advertisement in a St. Louis newspaper while visiting her younger sister Hattie, who was living in the city and working at a milliner's shop on Chestnut Street, and who had pressed the page flat on the kitchen table and said, without particular ceremony, that Vera ought to at least write. Vera had not written immediately. She had sat with the advertisement for 3 weeks, reading it on mornings when she felt capable of wanting something, and setting it aside on mornings when she did not. She had spent nearly 2 years after that first marriage not trusting her own judgment about what a situation actually was versus what it appeared to be. And she was careful now in a way she hadn't been before. Careful the way a person is careful after a hand has been burned. But she wrote, and then she wrote again. The letters she sent to the agency, which forwarded them to a post office box in Canyon Creek, were warm and composed and spoke of her enthusiasm for frontier life with a clarity and ease that surprised even her, because the warmth was partly real and partly a performance she had given herself permission to make. She was riding toward a version of herself she was not yet certain existed. She did not mention the 2 years of flatness that had preceded the letters. She did not mention that some mornings she still could not locate a reason to get out of a chair. She wrote about the Colorado mountains, which she had never seen, and the open country, which she had only imagined, and she used the word forward-looking 3 times in the first 4 letters until Hattie told her she sounded like a railroad advertisement, and she stopped. Dale received each of Vera's letters with a care that embarrassed him slightly. He read them at the table with coffee, and again at night by the lamp, and once more on the day before the next one arrived. Her sentences were precise without being cold and funny without trying to be, and by October he had stopped thinking of her as a correspondent and started thinking of her as a person he owed a great deal of honesty to and could not yet deliver. He wrote the 60th letter 2 weeks before she was due to arrive on the afternoon train from Pueblo, and in it he described a fine autumn on the ranch and the cattle going well and the house in good order. every word of which was as wishful as the 59 that had come before it. Vera arrived at the Canyon Creek Depot on a Thursday afternoon in October of 1882. The platform was short and windswept and smelled of coal smoke and the creek bottom below the town. She stepped down from the rail car in a gray wool coat with a carpet bag in each hand and looked at the valley that opened wide and tawny to the south, and felt for a moment that she had been right to come, that whatever the man at the end of the wagon road turned out to be, the country was genuinely fine. Then Dale came forward from where he had been standing by the hitching post and took her bags, and the two of them stood in the October light for a moment with the Colorado sky enormous above them, both of them measuring the distance between the person in front of them and the person they had been corresponding with for 6 months, and both of them finding that distance wider than they had prepared for. He was shorter than she had imagined. She was quieter than her letters had promised. The wagon ride south out of Canyon Creek covered 7 miles of valley road through scrub oak and yellow grass, and they managed in those 7 miles to discuss the weather and the condition of the road and the price of beef at Pueblo, and nothing else. The silence between the topics was not hostile. It had the quality of two people who had each said a great deal on paper and found now that paper was no longer between them, that they were not entirely sure who the other one was. Vera watched the creek running shallow between cottonwoods going gold, and kept her hands folded in her lap, and thought that the country was as fine as she had imagined, and that the man beside her was more nervous than she had expected, which she found, to her own mild surprise, somewhat reassuring. The house was 1 room with a dirt floor and a cast-iron stove and a shelf of 6 books that Dale had placed there, specifically because Vera's letters had mentioned books, and he had borrowed them from a neighbor the day before. She noticed the books immediately, and noticed they were arranged with the spines facing inward, which meant he was not certain of the titles, and she recognized this for what it was, a small kind gesture executed imperfectly, and it told her something useful about him that 300 head of cattle and a finished wood floor could never have told her. She set her bags on the floor. He stood in the doorway and said the floor was temporary, that he had boards coming from the mill in the spring. She said that was fine, that she had grown up in a farmhouse with a kitchen floor that buckled every April, and nobody had perished. He nodded, and she could see the dead of the 60 letters sitting in his expression like something he was carrying without quite being able to set down. She decided, standing in that single room with the dirt floor and the backwards books, that she was going to let him find his own way to the confession. She had not come this far to make it harder. The first supper was salt pork and cornbread, and a pot of beans that had gone slightly past themselves, and Dale ate it with a straight face and no complaint, which Vera appreciated because she had cooked it and she knew what it was. She was a competent cook in Illinois kitchens and on Illinois stoves, but the altitude and the cast-iron beast on the dirt floor had their own ideas, and she had decided that the beans would not beat her, but that they had won the first night. They ate by lamplight. The window behind Dale's shoulder showed the valley going dark, and the first stars appearing over the ridge to the east. And Vera watched the stars and thought about Hattie back in St. Louis, who had made her promise to write within the week. She wrote Hattie that Saturday. She described the house accurately, including the floor, and the valley, also accurately, and Dale she described as a man who seemed to mean well and was carrying something he hadn't yet put down, which she told Hattie she recognized from prior experience and which she had decided to be patient about. She did not say the word lonely in the letter, but it was in the spaces between the sentences, and Hattie, who knew how to read her sister, would find it there. By the end of the first week, the shape of things was clear. Dale rode out each morning before light and worked the herd through the day. 31 cattle on 40 acres of winter grass, and Vera learned the stove's moods and the well's temperament, and the particular angle at which the door had to be lifted to close without catching. She also learned, on the 4th day, the exact size of the feed debt, which Dale told her at the kitchen table, in the tone of a man confessing to a priest, all the numbers laid out flat and honest. $240 owed to a man named Endicott in Pueblo, due in installments through the following spring. He told her about the 31 cattle. He did not explain the 60 letters directly, but he spread the whole real situation before her and let it speak for itself. And she sat across the table from him with her hands around a coffee cup and listened to all of it without interrupting, because she had been waiting for this since the depot platform, and she was not going to rush it now. When he finished, the lamp was throwing his shadow long against the back wall, and outside the wind had come up off the ridge. She said, "I wrote you that I was looking forward to frontier life as though I'd always wanted it. I'd never been west of the Mississippi before I boarded the train." He looked at her. She said, "I was writing what I hoped would be true by the time I got here. It seemed fair to tell you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I ordered paper from St. Louis to write proper letters on. Cost me $6.50 I didn't have." She almost smiled. She said, "I noticed the paper." They did not discuss it further that night. The conversation had done its work without ceremony, and they both understood that the 60 letters and the 2 years of careful warmth were not lies exactly, but something more like maps drawn in advance of the territory, imprecise and hopeful and already out of date. The territory was here. The maps could be set aside. Through November and into December, Vera learned the ranch at a pace that surprised Dale and surprised herself. She had grown up on a working Illinois farm, and she knew cattle and fence lines and cold weather. And what the Colorado country demanded on top of that was a tolerance for the particular quality of mountain cold, which was a different creature than Illinois cold, drier and sharper and uncompromising after dark. She learned to bank the stove at night and to leave water in a pan near the coals so it wouldn't freeze before morning. She mended a section of the south fence with Dale one December afternoon, while the temperature dropped steadily and neither of them spoke for 2 hours, and the silence was, by then, a comfortable kind of thing, free of the weight it had carried on the wagon ride from the depot. Her hands blistered on the fence wire and she kept working, and Dale saw her wrap the blisters in a strip of cloth cut from her own hem and say nothing about it. And he stored this fact quietly in the way a man stores a thing he does not yet have words for. Dale paid the first installment to Endicott in Pueblo in December, $40 delivered in person after a drive south through sleet. He came home with the receipt in his coat pocket and told Vera over supper, and she said good, and that was the whole of the celebration, which suited them both. Hattie wrote back in December. The letter reached Vera just before Christmas, full of St. Louis news and milliner's gossip and the kind of warm, specific detail that Vera had been hungry for, without realizing it. Hattie asked how the man was and how the cattle were, and whether the floor was still dirt. Vera read the letter twice at the kitchen table and then folded it and tucked it in the pocket of her winter coat, where it stayed through Christmas and into January, worn soft at the folds from being taken out, and reread on the cold mornings when she was riding fence or carrying water from the well. January was the month that asked questions. The cattle needed extra feeding in the cold, and the hay supply was drawn down faster than the calendar said it should be. And Dale spent 3 days in January riding the fence line in temperatures that dropped to 22 below at night and stayed at 10 below through the days, checking for drift damage and breaks from ice weight on the wire. Vera cut her own firewood that month, not because Dale hadn't left enough, but because she wanted to know she could do it. and she could. The axe was heavier than she liked, and the rhythm of it took her 3 mornings to find, but she found it, and by the 3rd week of January there was a stack against the north wall of the house that was as even and solid as any she had seen, and she felt, stacking the last cord, something she hadn't felt in 2 years, which was straightforward satisfaction in her own competence, no asterisk attached. Dale noticed the firewood and said nothing, but 2 days later he built a proper ledge on the bookshelf, a narrow notched board along the front edge to keep the books from sliding in the wind when the door opened hard. And he did this without being asked, and the ledge served no function the books had been suffering without, and they both understood what it was for. It was in the 1st week of February that the heifer came into difficulty. The temperature had dropped to 19 below the night of the 6th, a cold that settled into the valley like something deliberate and pressed the animals close against the south side of the barn. Dale had been watching the heifer for 3 days, a 2-year-old he'd bought in the fall from a rancher at Greenhorn Creek, and the signs were wrong. She was the first of the spring calving, and she was early, and she was struggling. He rode for the veterinarian before daybreak on the morning of the 7th, 17 miles north to the town of Maplewood, through a wind that was carrying snow horizontally off the ridge and reducing the road to a white suggestion in the gray before dawn. He told Vera to watch the heifer and to send for a neighbor named Pruitt 2 miles east if the situation turned. Vera did not send for Pruitt. She knew what she was looking at by mid-morning, a calf presenting wrong in the cold, and she had seen enough of this in Illinois to understand that waiting for someone else was a decision with its own costs. She rolled her sleeves above her elbows in the barn with the temperature at 19 below outside, and the barn holding it somewhere slightly less deadly than that, and she worked by the light of a lantern hung from a rafter nail, and by early afternoon the calf was breathing, ugly and wet and confused on the barn floor. She dried it with grain sacks and got it near its mother and stood in the straw with her arms aching and her hands shaking with the cold, and she thought with a clarity she had not expected that her judgment had been sound, that she had read the situation correctly and acted on it, and the reading had held. She did not leave the barn that night, not because the calf was in danger exactly, but because she was not yet willing to stop watching it breathe. She sat in the corner of the stall with her back against the boards, and Hattie's letter tucked in her coat pocket against her chest, and the calf slept, and she slept, and the lantern burned down to almost nothing, and she trimmed it twice before it steadied. The second night was harder. The wind came up after midnight and the barn boards creaked, and the temperature outside by the sound of things had dropped further. She pulled feed sacks over herself in the corner and kept the lantern going and talked to the calf the way she had talked to sick animals as a girl on the Illinois farm, low and steady and about nothing in particular, just sound to fill the cold air. The heifer watched her with dark, patient eyes, and Vera thought about her first marriage, not with grief but with a kind of settled accounting, the way you think about an old debt that has been paid. She had been afraid, in the 2 years after it, that she had spent her best judgment on a poor situation, and had none left over for a better one. The calf breathed steadily beside her in the barn straw, and she revised that estimate. The third night she fell asleep, sitting up before she intended to, with her chin on her chest and the lantern guttering low, and she did not hear Dale come back. He came into the barn at first light on the morning of the 9th, 17 miles back, through a road that had drifted knee-deep in 2 places and required him to lead the horse the last quarter-mile by hand. He was cold in a way that had moved past discomfort and past pain, and into something quieter than either. The veterinarian had not been available until the 2nd day, and had ridden back with him through the snow and was caring for his own horse at Pruitt's barn down the road. Dale pushed the barn door open against the snow piled behind it and held the lantern up. Vera was asleep against the stallboards with her coat pulled tight around her and her boots crossed in the straw. The calf was on its feet, pressed warm against its mother's side, breathing slow and regular in the cold air. Hay dust moved in the lantern light. The heifer looked at Dale with the same patient expression she always had, and went back to her calf. He stood in the barn doorway long enough to understand what had happened over 3 nights. The full cost of it visible in Vera's cracked and reddened hands, folded in her lap, and in the worn-down stubs of the candles she'd used when the lantern oil ran low, and in the grain sacks tucked around her feet. He thought of the firewood stacked against the north wall of the house, and the fence mended in December, and the beans that had not beaten her on the first night, and every quiet, competent thing she had done in the 4 months since she stepped off the depot platform at Canyon Creek with 2 carpet bags and no expression he'd been able to read. He set his lantern on the post hook. He went out to the woodpile by the barn's east wall and began stacking an armload of split pine by the barn door, enough for the morning and half the afternoon. He carried 4 loads and stacked them dry against the wall where they'd be easy to reach. Then he went into the house and got the stove going and put water on, and cut salt pork, and found the cornmeal, and he had the stove lit, and the food started before Vera came in from the barn, still in her coat, with straw in her hair, and the expression of a person who has just woken up and is taking inventory of herself to determine the condition of the parts. She looked at the stove going and the pan on, and the firewood stacked by the barn door, visible through the window, and she did not say anything, and he did not say anything, and they ate breakfast in the gray February light with the valley out still white, and the creek running black through the snow, and the silence between them was, by then, as different from the silence on the wagon ride from the depot as the valley in February was from the valley in October. It was the same country. It was not the same silence. If there is a thing the frontier does reliably, it is this. It removes what is decorative. The 60 letters were decoration. The careful warmth performed on stationery in St. Louis was decoration. What remained after a 19 below February night in a barn was the actual shape of 2 people, and both of them could see it plainly. The circuit preacher, Reverend Oakes, arrived at Canyon Creek on a Saturday in March of 1883 after a 4-day ride from his winter circuit in the San Luis Valley. He was a spare man in a black coat gone greenish at the elbows, and he carried his Bible in a saddlebag and his expectations low, which was the correct equipment for the work. He performed 3 weddings that week in the valley, and Dale and Vera's was the second, held at the homestead on a cold, bright morning with the snow still on the ridge, but the south-facing slope showing the first yellow grass of the approaching spring. Hattie was there. She had come out on the train from St. Louis 2 weeks before, arriving at the Canyon Creek Depot with a trunk and a hat that was entirely unsuited to a dirt floor ranch house, and a face that broke into a genuine smile the moment she saw her sister standing on the platform. She was plain-spoken and curious, and asked Dale 6 direct questions about the ranch on the first evening, not rudely but with the efficient interest of a person who needed to know the actual situation and was not prepared to wait for it to be volunteered. Dale answered all 6 questions accurately and without embellishment. And Hattie told Vera later in the low voices of sisters who have been talking privately since childhood that she thought he was a fair man, and that the country was as wild as advertised, and that the floor was definitely still dirt. The wedding was brief. Reverend Oakes read the necessary words in a carrying voice, and Hattie served as witness, and the cattle were audible from the pasture behind the barn, and the March wind came off the ridge with the smell of pine and meltwater. And when it was done, Dale and Vera shook hands with the preacher, and Hattie brought out a pan of biscuits she had made that morning, which were excellent. And Reverend Oakes ate 2 of them and departed before noon, because he had a 3rd wedding to reach before the weather changed. There were no speeches. There was coffee, and there were Hattie's biscuits, and there was the valley opening south and west in the cold spring light. And that was the ceremony. And it was enough. Hattie stayed 2 more weeks. She helped Vera put in the kitchen garden, and she mended a section of curtain. And she and Dale achieved an understanding in the second week, based largely on her willingness to help mend fence, and his willingness to admit she was better at it than he was. She left on a Tuesday, back to St. Louis and the millinery shop on Chestnut Street, and Vera walked her to the wagon, and they held each other for a moment without saying much, because they had been doing this at every parting since they were girls, and they had long ago worked out that words at the leaving point were mostly insufficient. Hattie promised to write. She always did, and she always kept the promise, which was a rarer combination than it sounded. The spring and summer of 1883 moved at the pace of work, which on a cattle operation in the Canyon Creek Valley meant a pace that did not stop for sentiment or weather, but could sometimes be persuaded to slow down on a Sunday afternoon. The herd grew to 38 cattle with the spring calves, including the heifer's calf, a rough little bull who had entered the world sideways in a 19-below barn and seemed determined to make the most of the oversight. Dale paid the second installment to Endicott in Pueblo in April, another $40, and the third in July. Vera kept the house accounts in a ledger she had brought from Illinois, and the numbers told a story that was not yet comfortable, but was no longer alarming, and the difference between those 2 states was itself a kind of progress. In the fall of 1883, Dale broke ground on an addition to the house, a second room that would serve as a proper bedroom, and he laid a wood plank floor in both rooms using boards from the Canyon Creek mill, and Vera stood in the doorway watching him set the last board and said, somewhat dryly, that she had not required a wood floor to stay this long and did not expect she needed one going forward either. He said he knew that. He put the floor in anyway. The last installment on the feed debt was paid to Endicott in the spring of 1884. $120 cleared in a single payment after a good cattle season and a neighbor's purchase of 6 head at a fair price. Dale came home from Pueblo with the receipt in his coat pocket for the second time and told Vera over supper that Endicott had said he was square, and Vera closed the ledger on the feed debt page and set the ledger on the shelf beside the books, and they went to bed, and that was the whole of that. If you have ever wanted to leave a comment on a story like this is the moment. Because there are people watching this who have written a letter toward a version of themselves they hoped would be true by the time it arrived, and they know exactly what that costs. Tell us in the comments whether you think 2 people can build something honest out of letters that weren't. We'd like to hear, and if you have not yet watched the story of the widow who kept the Platte River Ranch through a winter that nobody believed she could survive, it is waiting for you at the end of this one. The years settled into a rhythm that the valley knew better than either of them did. Cold fall and harder winter and a spring that came back every time. Reliable in the way only things are reliable that have been doing a thing long before you arrived, and will continue long after. Hattie came out from St. Louis every 3rd summer, always with a trunk that was slightly too large for the spare bedroom, and always with opinions about the kitchen that Vera received with good humor, and occasionally with pointed silence depending on the opinion. She and Dale continued to have the particular friendship of 2 people who were both committed to the same woman's well-being, and had the sense to be practical about it rather than jealous. The first child was born in January of 1885, a girl they named Margaret, delivered by the Canyon Creek doctor in the new back bedroom with the wood plank floor. The second was a boy, born in the spring of 1887, and they named him Warren after Dale's father, who had homesteaded in Kansas and died there in 1874, and left Dale the habit of silence and the knowledge of cattle and very little else. Both children grew up knowing the valley the way children know a thing they were born into, without the effort of learning it, which was different from the way their parents knew it, and in some ways more complete. The 40 acres became 60 in 1891, when a neighbor named Garvey sold the south quarter of his property to pay a debt, and Dale bought it on terms he could manage. He built a new fence line along the south boundary in late autumn of that year, and Vera rode the line with him on a November afternoon, with the sky the flat gray of a coming snow and the cattle bunched along the creek. And she looked at the 60 acres and felt the expansion of it, not as wealth exactly, but as room. The sense that the country they were working had given a little more of itself to them in return for 16 years of not giving up on it. Then, in 1907, they added another 30 acres from the east side, buying out an adjacent homestead whose owner had moved to Denver for reasons of health, and the ranch reached 90 acres and stayed there. By then, Margaret was teaching school in Alamosa, and Warren was working the ranch alongside Dale, learning the particular combination of stubbornness and patience the land required. And the feed account at the Pueblo supplier was paid current every quarter, without exception, which was its own kind of statement. The letters burned in the winter of 1905. Dale found the box of them on a shelf in the barn one November afternoon while reorganizing the tack room, 60 letters in their original envelopes, worn and slightly foxed at the edges from years of dry Colorado winters. He brought the box inside and set it on the kitchen table, and he and Vera looked at it for a moment, and then Vera said she supposed they could read them and see who those two people were. And Dale said he already knew who those two people were and didn't need the paper, and Vera said that was fair. And they burned the box in the stove on a Tuesday evening while the snow came down outside, and watched the paper curl and go, and neither of them said anything, and neither of them needed to. Dale's death came in August of 1917, a Tuesday morning, quietly and without spectacle, in the back bedroom of the house with the wood plank floor, with Warren on one side of the bed and Vera on the other, and the window open to the sound of the creek running in the August heat. He was 66. He had ranched the Canyon Creek Valley for 35 years, the last 34 of them alongside a woman he had described, in 60 letters, as living in a prosperity he had not yet achieved, and who had arrived at the Canyon Creek Depot in a gray wool coat and decided inside a week that the man with the dirt floor and the backwards books was someone she could stay beside. They buried him on the ridge above the homestead on the east side, where the ground was rocky, but the view south across the valley was clear to the mountains, and Vera chose the place herself and stood at the graveside in the August afternoon with Warren and Margaret and Hattie beside her, Hattie having come out from street, Louie on the train when the telegram arrived, grayer and quieter than she had been, but still Hattie, still plain-spoken, still the person who pressed a newspaper advertisement flat on a kitchen table in 1882 and changed the whole course of 2 lives with an opinion. After the burial, Hattie stayed a month, the longest she had ever stayed, and in the evenings she and Vera sat on the step outside the back door and watched the light go off the ridge and talked about everything and nothing the way they had been doing since they were girls. And on the last night before Hattie's train back to St. Louis, Vera said that she had not known what she was going to until she was already doing it, and Hattie said that was how it usually worked with the things worth knowing, and they left it there. Vera tended the grave on the ridge for 11 years after that. She kept the ranch going with Warren through 1919, then handed him the operation formally. The deed signed at the Canyon Creek land office on a March morning, and moved into the smaller room in the house, which had been enlarged twice over the years and had, by then, a kitchen that no longer startled her, and a stove she had known for 36 years and understood in all its moods. She kept the ledger current through habit, even after the numbers were Warren's to manage, because the ledger had been her way of knowing where things stood since the fall of 1882, and she saw no reason to change it. The heifer's calf, the rough bull from the 19 below February night, had grown old and gone by 1893, which was a long life for a bull and a fair return on 3 nights in a cold barn. Vera had noted his passing in the ledger, which was not strictly an accounting matter, but which she had decided was her ledger and she could note what she chose. In the summer of 1928, on a morning in July with the valley hot and still and the creek lower than it usually ran, Vera walked up to the ridge above the homestead, carrying a handful of wildflowers she had cut from the south-facing slope, where the grass came back earliest each spring. She was 74. Her hands, cracked and strong and capable through every decade of the 46 years she had spent in the Canyon Creek Valley, had slowed in the last 2 winters and did not carry weight as well as they once had. But they carried the flowers without difficulty. She set the flowers at the base of the grave marker and stood for a while in the morning quiet, with the valley spread below her, 90 acres of it and the mountains beyond, and the creek a silver thread through the yellow grass of July, and the sky enormous and blue the way it had been on the October afternoon in 1882 when she stepped off the train at the Canyon Creek Depot with 2 carpet bags and a gray wool coat, and looked out at a country that was exactly as fine as she had imagined, and a man who was nothing like his letters and turned out to be precisely what she needed. She stood on the ridge for a long time. The creek ran below and the valley held its summer quiet, and the mountains were the mountains, unchanged and unhurried, the way they had been before the letters and before the depot, and before any of it, and would be long after. She walked back down the slope when she was ready, slowly and without rushing, in the good July morning.